So my guest, say your name?
Yes, it rhymes with Pierre. It's French.
Lierre. That's very nice.
You got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
so if this is your first time tuning into V Radio, I do a lot of conversations like these. More, 1 second, sorry about that. I was listening to myself because the show is playing on another clip. Anyway, if this is your first time coming on V Radio, I do a lot of conversations like this. I had on, senators, activists, presidential candidates, etc. Throughout the years. I used to do podcast as one of my main formats with a lot more conversations. My content nowadays has a lot of video to it. While I personally lean left as an independent, my content is designed to appeal to both sides within reason. I cannot promise that you will always agree with everything I say, nor do I actually want you to. I'm trying to create an environment where people can disagree with each other and, try to reach, dialectic, exchange information, perhaps you might, revise one of your positions because of something I said, and maybe you won't. All I'm asking you to do is think. And you can check me out at hy.page/vradio. Today, as I mentioned earlier, my guest is Lierre Keith. Lierre, I always begin my conversations with the question, what was the precipice moment for you? What made you decide to go from just being a regular person who, goes through life, maybe votes, does their work, cashes their check, pays their taxes, to becoming an activist?
So I'm one of those people that never had that moment because I was raised by a mom who was a feminist. And my dad was certainly a very thoughtful, critical person as well. And I was born in 1964. And one of my very earliest memories is the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. I remember that as this huge trauma. And I remember my parents going to the big march in Washington against the Vietnam War. And that was like the coolest thing that my parents did that. And also, they picked up hitchhikers on the way home. It was like, this was like the coolest thing your parents could possibly do. And they did it. So that was fun. But no, I mean, I was always raised to be a critical thinker and somebody who would sort of take up the mantle of responsibility as a citizen of the world, that there were wrongs that had to be righted. And it was going to be part of my job to do that. So this particular apple did not fall far from the tree. I know that's not true for a lot of people, that they have a big awakening, but a lot of this was stuff that I heard growing up. There was a framework that I easily slid into, to become a radical that was never foreign to me. So yeah.
Well, so then you basically just had a socially conscious childhood from the very beginning.
Yeah, and like my mom would explain things to us about racism, like really hard things to tell children, but she did her best to have those kinds of teaching moments with her kids, and it was very serious, and we all took it very seriously. And we'd get in the car to go somewhere, and we would all sing folk songs, like Joan Baez songs, or like songs against the war. Like that was just the culture that I was in, that my mom was in, that I was in. And then she went to consciousness raising, feminist consciousness raising in the early 70s, and then like really got fired up about feminism. So all of that was sort of the background to my growing up years.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I had you on once before. You were recommended me by Derek Jensen, and we had kind of a brief. I'd like to try to do it again. A panel of like leftists who are from kind of like the generation before that are kind of like scratching their head, going like, "What the hell is going on?" Like, the left seems to have just completely lost its mind, and I personally, would have considered myself a feminist in the 80s and 90s. Like I was all about, girls should be allowed to do anything that they're capable of doing. I was all, I admired strong female characters that were portrayed at that time. People always throw out Ripley from Aliens or Sarah Connor from Terminator 2. My mom was a strong single woman, who was really the primary parental force for me. So I was already kind of headed in that direction. And, I found myself really, I wasn't like, marching at that time, but still, I strongly was supportive of the idea that women should be treated as equals and, that, that they're humans. I wasn't on board with like I guess, I mean, well, I lived essentially in a matriarchy, although my mother never tried to attribute her gender to her position of authority, but I never had any problems with women in authority. So it was like, then there was two things that I noticed. The first of which was that it just kind of started to become, not only do I want, women to be equal, but now it almost, you start to lean in this direction, and it's not just feminism, it's happening like in every seeming one of these social justice isms, is that you notice that the line between I'm seeking equality to I hate the other side, like almost just outright becoming bigoted and hateful towards whatever the opposite is, hateful towards white people, hateful towards men, hateful, and I guess there was probably always some of that in the feminist movement, but that these are just my perceptions from outside, and that's why I wanted to bring on a feminist that I trusted, who's sane, who's an intellectual. First, let's walk me through this, because it was something we kind of discussed a little bit on the previous stream, was just, and then we kind of discussed, we'll discuss it at another time, but like, there's all these waves of feminism, and then we talk about the third wave. So I guess just bring me up to speed on what happened to feminism.
Well, in terms of history, what they call the first wave would have been the suffrage movement around the world. And so, and that in really, there was a whole spectrum of women who were involved in that. Some of them were more conservative, some of them were more liberal, some of them were absolutely radical and wanted to transform all of society. So that takes place. There's about an almost 100-year period, 75 years, where women are trying to get the vote because they see that we're not full citizens and that we will never be full citizens until we're given access to the public sphere, and especially civic participation. So voting, running for office, being appointed to the judiciary, being able to go to law school, all of that is going to have to happen in order for women to get anywhere. And you have to remember that like in Britain, until the Married Women's Property Act, women literally did not even own the clothes on their backs. They belonged to either their fathers or their husbands. So that's where women started, was just being property of men. So either your father or your husband owned you and could do whatever he wanted, which
Right.
meant he could beat you if he wanted. He could put you in a mental institution, which were just giant torture prisons at that point. If he was tired of you, he could just walk away and abandon you with your children, and you'd have really no way to support yourself. So that's, this whole impulse about, well, we got to get the vote. For a lot of women, that's what was behind it. It's like, hey, this is kind of a linchpin. If we can get the vote thing, then a lot of these other problems we can start to solve, because we can elect candidates who care about this. We can run for office ourselves. We can start to transform the political sphere towards something that cares about women and children. And the most radical of these women really understood very deeply how male dominated the culture was. So they criticized religion. Um, like that was a big deal in the year 1900, that you could reject the Bible or rewrite the Bible, which one of them did. She wrote a woman's Bible. Um, like people just, that was a big new deal, that you could decide about things like, we could reject religion entirely. There weren't a lot of people doing that. So, and then these movements are never alone, right? There's never just a standalone feminist movement. Most of the women who were, on the more left-leaning side, the more radical, I mean, it was the same as it is today, where you had, they were fighting slavery, so you had the abolition movement, all, trying to fight racism. And then you had, the labor movement was all involved in this as well, because of course women, could barely earn a living. The factory wages for women were so much lower than what men were getting, and that was just considered perfectly fine. But it meant, women were taking their 4-year-old children to work in dangerous factories because there was nowhere else to put them.
Right.
And then you'd be on your feet all day working dangerous equipment, on and on. The conditions, the famous ones that caught on fire and everybody died, like just these horrible things were happening. So all of that gets wrapped up in the condition of well, because women and children are, always make up the majority of who lives in poverty. So all the really good suffrage leaders were involved in all of these movements at once. And so it really is a total vision for society, right? And they do see the linchpin as being, okay, that we got to get this vote thing settled first. Like that's the most important thing we can do, and then we can use that to try to transform the world. And one of my favorite, oh, this is my Jamie. If you're watching, this is baby. Her niece has decided to enter the frame. Hi, baby. You want to lie down? So One of my favorite the suffragists, the family of them actually, who were involved in the suffrage movement, is the Pankhursts, and they were British feminist suffragists, but they were also very involved in the abolition movement and the labor movement. And Emmeline Pankhurst, the mom in the family, her husband died, and so then she had to struggle on her own. So she got a job working for the Registry of Births, like the Census Department in London. And what it meant was she had to register, like when women had a baby, it was her job to basically make the official birth kind of certificate, to count the number of people being born. And what this meant was day after day, she saw these very young, I mean, girls, teenage girls would come in to register their babies, and they'd be 14 years old. They weren't married, of course. And then she would say, all right, we have to put the father on this line. Who's the father? And they would just start crying because, of course, these babies were born from rape, and usually incestuous rape. And she saw
Right.
this over and over and over. And she's like, we've got to do something. Like, what is happening to teenage? Look what's happening to these girls. And everybody just thinks, what, this is fine, or we're not going to talk about it. So in the same way that during my lifetime, I feel like women had to like break the silence about this level of male violence, women had already done that. Like that already happened in 1915. And, it just gets swallowed up again. So
Right.
that was one of the main motivating forces for them, was like just the level of deprivation, the level of violence that women and girls were living under for men. And it was considered, quote, the private sphere. So the moment that it's not political, it's just in this other realm, and it means you can't question it because it's not seen through a political lens. It's seen as natural or normal or the way that God created it, or evolution somehow has something to do with this. But what it means is you can never say, oh, this is actually a function of power. You've got this group of people, and they have power over this other group of people, and they subordinate them and they exploit them, and this is wrong. And because humans made it up, we can unmake it up and we can get to a better world. And that is honestly the difference between radicals and liberals, because radicals see all that, and liberals generally, they want certain maybe civil rights in the public, in the public realm, but they never really break through into that sort of public private, those sort of separate spheres. So
Right.
there's not that total transformation, that they're not really after that. The system is basically okay. We just need to tinker with it. So anyway, the most radical of the suffragists understood all of this. They were very clear about, I mean, they were the people who invented playgrounds because they wanted there to be a safe place for kids to be out in public where they weren't going to be molested or kidnapped or otherwise hurt by male predators. And so they wanted to make an actual physical space that was usually surrounded by at least some kind of a fence. So there was a boundary, but it meant all the moms could watch all the kids go out in public, let the kids get exercise. The moms can, talk to each other, but we know this is a safe place for children. So it's little things like that that we now take for granted, but somebody had to think that up. Like, how do we make this world a better place for the children? And of course, it's always going to be women at the forefront of that because the mother-child bond is so primary. Anyway, so I don't know, I'm just rambling at this point, but they were some very radical women, and you can read their works now, and they have absolutely stood the test of time. And they got it done. They got the vote done. So, and they had to take up some very militant tactics to do that. And this is the part where I got very excited as a young child learning about the suffrage movement,
Sure.
because they tried this for 2 generations. And like Christabel Pankhurst has this great quote about, we wandered in the political wilderness for 40 years, trying to win by just persuading men using rational argument, and it didn't work. We had to apply political force. So the whole point of the WSPU, which was the Women's Social Political Union, that was what the Pankhurst started, was to bring some more militant tactics to this movement, because the women had been trying for 2 generations. They'd basically gotten nowhere. And they're like, all right, we're going to up the stakes here. What can we do to make these men in power pay attention to our demands? So we need political force and we need to apply it. And so that's when they start breaking windows. They start doing these massive demonstrations, essentially civil disobedience. They start like hounding male politicians. They were going to force these men to answer the question, votes for women. Do you support votes for women? So anytime, Winston Churchill, whoever appeared in public, they would just start yelling, votes for women, where are you on the woman question? They would unfurl banners, they would all get arrested, but they would just follow them everywhere and like, you're going to answer us. So they tried all kinds of creative things. Eventually they get put in jail, and then the hunger strikes start. and they're force fed in prison. And this just explodes the entire issue, because when you're doing that kind of nonviolent direct action, the entire point is to make the violence visible. And the women didn't create the violence, they just made it visible. And so what you're seeing there is male violence against women organized through the arm of the state. And they made that very, very clear. This is how much these men hate us. They are willing to torture us rather than to listen to our arguments. And they ultimately won the day, because people don't like that. They don't really like watching people get tortured, especially when they're asking for something that's quite reasonable. So they were able to win the vote, and they did it in America too. They did it around the world. I think the last country was 1972, but we do now have well, Afghanistan, whatever. But we have generally, in
Right.
principle anyway, we have universal suffrage for everyone. Everyone's supposed to be able to vote now. And people died to get the vote. There were Black people who died in this country to get, the Voting Rights Act. So
And I wanted to
I
make
think
a
I'm,
quick point
yeah, go
about
ahead.
what you said about the effectiveness of peaceful
Nonviolent direct
protest,
action. Right.
specifically that it makes it extremely clear who the bad guys really are.
Yeah.
It's not just a question of the morality of violence or nonviolence. It's that as soon as you start, getting into the muck with the violence, you're muddying the waters, and that allows the other side to try to make themselves look like they have some legitimate reason, to be batting you around. I remember when I was a kid, they used to still show the footage of like Martin Luther King protests of
Sure.
these, Black activists, like often like dressed in suits and stuff, like kneeling down, in civil disobedience, being savagely beaten, by cops. There was no question at that point who the good guys were. There was no, and that has an impact. Like you said, people don't like seeing people being tortured. That's why it works.
Yeah.
I think that it's unfortunate that the modern left seems to have completely lost sight of that. Like in Occupy, we were very, very strictly nonviolent. And anytime people did show up and do violence, we owned it. Like we said, that's not us. We're not affiliated with that. We're not interested in that. Like we would literally do press releases and say that that's not what we're about. And I guess I just wanted to take a moment because you pointed that out, and it's relevant. And I think that the issue has been mired in more of a matter of, well, it's mean to do these things. I'm like, it's not about that. It's not about morality about it in so much as just it's not effective. If you actually want people to listen to you and care about what you have to say, then behaving like a monster doesn't make them more interested in what you have to say. It gives them a way out. It gives them a way of saying, well, now I don't have to listen to you, you know? Um,
Yeah.
so anyway, I guess segue now, unless there was more that you felt was vital, into where we head into the direction to where you find yourself, and I've seen the feminist movement has this weird divide going on because of the trans issue, but also just like in the kind of the woke inquisition way of doing things that is now going on, it just never seems to be satisfied. It's like the purity is never enough, and then it results in the left tearing itself apart. But it also results in people becoming kind of distancing themselves. Like, I don't think I want to be part of feminism anymore. I don't want to be associated with this. So I guess, like, and from your perspective, because you went through kind of a situation where you're all in to suddenly being a controversial figure within your own movement. So I mean, go ahead and share that.
Before we do that, I just want to address something in the comments, which I think is very serious. One
Sure.
of your people here says that men are victims of violence more than women, and that is true. And this is why I wish more men would join us, because you're absolutely at risk from male violence as well. Men murder more men beat up more men, and old men send huge numbers of young men to slaughter each other in completely senseless wars. So, yes, it is true. And your lives matter, and your hearts matter, and your souls matter, and this shouldn't be happening. So the question is why? Why are men doing this to each other, and why are they doing it to women? And I think that feminism provides a pretty good answer to that. If you have a better answer to it, well, I hope you do something about it based on that framework. But I think that men have everything to gain from adopting a feminist framework to the world, because it's you are the ones who are on the front line against other men. And really, the question is why? Why are men doing this to each other?
Right.
Um,
And I think that
so
the comments are kind of reflective of what it is we're talking about, is that a lot of this lashing out is happening because of like, I kind of came to an epiphany once, and this is again as a left leaning activist. I was like, I am not a misandrist, but all of the closest, I'm sorry, misogynist. I'm not a misogynist, but all the closest misogynist thoughts I've ever had in my life didn't come from interacting with women in my life. They came from interacting with feminists. And then I
Right.
was like, and all the closest to the tiniest closest to racist thoughts I've ever had, or to, transphobic thoughts or whatever thoughts, they didn't come from interacting with regular people in those movements, or not in the movements, among those types of people, right? They came from interacting with the activists who are supposed to supposedly be making everything better. Like, they don't have the ability to answer the question like you just did, right? With poise and calm and confidence, because you actually want to change minds. It seems like now the current activists, I don't know if they know they're trying to alienate people. Maybe they do. I think I tend to wonder, honestly, you could put your tinfoil hat on, but like when I was at Occupy and you just watched us go from the unified 99% to suddenly becoming this bickering group of infighting people who are all jockeying for position in a new hierarchy of which one of us is the most oppressed and therefore the most important, and then it just tore it to pieces. And then eventually Occupy went from being honestly, it was a classism movement
Yeah.
that enjoyed a lot of popular support.
It did.
Like,
It did. When it first started, everybody was on board.
right. And
Everybody was feeling what happened, when the economy collapsed in 2008. Everybody lost their retirements, people lost their houses, we saw who got rich, and here came this movement, and it was supposed to be this great thing. I had so much hope. That first week, it was like, "Wow, they're gonna get it done." And
right.
then it all just collapsed.
Right, exactly. And I think that the people in the comments think that they're talking to a feminist from like the current, the people associated with purple hair, but I don't think that's correct. But you get my point, is that the current college campus feminists that would do things like, if you and I were having this conversation, they would want you censored and you're a
Oh, yeah.
feminist.
No, absolutely, and then
Like
they would
they
want you, like, strung up and
right,
what like,
exactly.
th
And that's
neither of us would survive that environment. We'd both be doing it exactly wrong, and not only wrong, like, "Oh, let's have a disagreement," but wrong, like, "These people need to be killed because they're so wrong."
right, yeah, we're definitely in that direction, and if you can corner them, or more specifically, even just blend in with them and they don't realize, they'll say a lot of really disturbing stuff when they don't think that they're being, and they're in an audience that would actually have a problem with it. And I just so that's where, we come to a point where I noticed that, um like, for example, the racial stuff is kind of just more and more every day just starts to sound like a supremacist ideology. Like, now we, no, it's actually this other color. They're actually the superior ones, and everybody else is inferior. I'm like, where have I heard this before? Like, I'm like, and do you think this is helping? Do you think anybody's less racist because they listen to you, have this conversation about how the other race is terrible and that your race is actually the one that invents everything or creates everything? I'm like, this is starting to sound a lot like Nazi master race theory, but with feminists, I don't really encounter a lot of what I would say is a um supremacist. Like, I don't think you're dealing with female supremacists. I have heard people say things like, we need a matriarchy, or, if we just let women run everything, there would be no wars, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of makes me raise an eyebrow, because there were plenty of wars fought throughout the centuries that, women played some political part in making happen. But it's like, it more just has to do with the fact that I think that there are plenty of people who would be on board with the idea. Well, of course women should vote, right? Of course women should not be the property of their dads until they're married. Of course, that, like, who would be on their side, who are now instead in a situation where they feel like, not only can I not be part of that. That's the quiet part. Like you were saying, not everybody can be an activist, right? Well, they could, but do they have the courage? But also just the ones who are just like, okay, not only that, now I need to oppose you. Now I need to be sure my daughter is never exposed to even reasonable feminist thought. Like, because I don't want it to be associated with all this other stuff. Like, do you follow me? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I feel much the same about these other movements that I once was a part of, that I believed in with all my heart, that I still wish, we could get the ultimate goals done. It just went so terribly wrong on the left. And I think for me and for almost everybody I know, we are still trying to figure out what is the best language to use to explain where it all went so wrong. Like, I'm still struggling myself in a lot of confusion about the framework of like woke, whatever you want to call it, repressive tolerance, all of these sort of, ideas, the repressive left, um, the sort of victim ideology, like all of these things. I don't know what is the right word to be using. Like we used to talk about politically correct in the 80s, and we
Right.
all knew what we meant by that. And then the right took it on, and then we stopped being able to use it. So we don't really have that one anymore. Like that was an in-group term. That was the left rolling its eyes at itself and saying there are people who take this to such extremes that you can't have a conversation with them. They're
Right.
impossible. They're semi-abusive with it. Anybody can learn to be that person. Like you could hand me any sentence and I could tell you why you're being racist, classist, misogynist, whatever, anti mental patient, like whatever. Like you can find anybody can play the abuse game,
Right.
right? And but we had a phrase for that. It was like, oh God, she's just so politically correct sometimes, and you'd all sort of roll your eyes about it. But that wasn't the rules of the culture. That was like the sort of outliers that we all knew had just gone way too far with it. Now, I mean, people lose their jobs over this stuff, over completely innocent comments. Just a number of people I know who have lost their jobs in academia for saying completely innocent things that their students decide, well, that's clearly racist, so we're going to hound you for 2 years until you leave.
Right.
And that is a very, very common occurrence now. It's not like we can't pretend this isn't happening, and the left did it. So I'm still just struggling to figure out a decent analysis of this, because I'm not willing to give up on these movements. There is still terrible racism. We need to stop it on this planet. There is still, capitalism is still doing its thing, and there's this huge class of poor people on the planet, and some of us are rich because some of us are poor. You got the global north, the global south. They're eating the planet alive along the way. By the way, we'll throw that in. I mean, I still see the same problems that I've always seen, and I don't feel like I can talk about it with anybody because my movements have A, thrown me out, and B, you can't open your mouth without being um, not just canceled, but honestly just hounded out of the
It
movement, and
that
then
was the
threatened, and then your life is over essentially. You just get dragged, and then no one will speak to you.
well,
And
that was one of the reasons why this, like, I came to an epiphany that it's like this has gone beyond like a movement or an activist movement, and like people would kind of tongue in cheek refer to it as a religion, and you'd be like kind of rolling your eyes like, well, that's a little extreme. And then I kind of thought about it. I'm like, look, we live in a world now where Joe Rogan, voted for Bernie Sanders, gets catapulted all the way to the far right
yeah,
because he said anything anybody didn't like. Where, and then we could go further obvious. So Brett Weinstein, total leftist, worked at Evergreen State College, a very
well, yeah,
leftist college. Let's
yep,
catapult him all the way over to the far right, even
right,
though he holds a bunch of leftist views. Like, I'm still watching Tulsi Gabbard very closely, but as far
right,
as I know, she hasn't publicly changed any of her policies, which are almost virtually identical to Bernie Sanders. And we got to catapult her all the way over to the far right because she, doesn't agree with, trans athletes in sports. And we'll talk about that too. It's like, if that's the way it works, like, how does that even work? Because I get into the same thing all the time. I'm like, well, let me see if I have this right. So I'm a Nordic model, social democrat guy who believes in like Denmark and Finland and their way of doing things. How do I fit into the far right? Where do I go on the right that works? Like, is there a place in the far right for people who want universal health care? Is there a place in the far right for people who want, college tuition and maternity leave? There is no place for that. But the left wants you identify, but that's why I said it's like a religion, because if it was just an ideology, so for example, if you're discussing, say, libertarianism with a libertarian, you could be an anarchist libertarian, or you could be a minarchist libertarian, or but they wouldn't tell you you weren't a libertarian anymore. They wouldn't, and they certainly wouldn't tell you that you were a fascist statist just because maybe you prefer, I don't know, Mises over Rothbard or something, right? There were nuances. But now, if you don't follow everything to the letter, well, now effectively you are a blasphemer or a heretic, or, so therefore your one sin makes you in league with the devil. Even if you have done everything else according to the religion, right? And that's why I said it feels like a religion, because we can't have nuances, we can't have different positions on things. Like, for example, I'm a left-leaning guy who's pro-guns. So where do I go? Apparently there's no, but there's, that was even before that. I kind of noticed that our politics were in these packages, and you're not allowed to deviate from those packages. That was true to begin with, but it wasn't well, I'm not satisfied with just not inviting you to my barbecue. I want to be sure that you have no job, and I want to be
Right.
sure that your whole life is ruined. And
Right.
and if I can get away with doing violence to you, then I will.
Then
You
I
know,
will. Yeah.
and
This is
like,
not the left that I had anything. I don't recognize my people in these acts. I don't understand how it got this bad. This
and it's not
never would have happened in 1985. Like this, these were not the people that we were. And
right,
yet it is now. Well, I can't pretend this isn't what the left has become. But everybody I know is like we've been pushed to the very, the very outside, and we're looking in, going, "What in the world? How do we pull this thing out of the fire? Could we have stopped this 20 years ago?" Like, it's so. I'm just overwhelmed some days at how bad this has gotten so quickly. But to your
right,
point about religion, yes, and this is why I really appreciate guys like John McWhorter. His book about woke racism, he says it's a religion, and he goes through all the ways that it matches religion, and I think he's absolutely right. The question is, can you get them to see that? People who are still participating in this, can you get them to see that they're behaving just like, the witchfinder generals and they want to burn us all at the stake? I
right.
remember this was like back in the early 90s. Um, so I'm going to back up 1 second.
Sure,
If
sure.
you listen to, Peter Boghossian and his whole channel, he was one
Oh
of
yeah.
the hoax guys. Yeah, I love Peter Boghossian's stuff. There's a series that I found through him where there's this guy whose name this is what I don't remember his name is the problem, but he has it's like a three-part thing that's like the history of the education schools in the United States, the colleges that took on sort of education as a concept, and how they were the ones who really drove this kind of woke politics into academia. And it's absolutely fascinating. It fills in a whole bunch of sort of blank spaces that I didn't understand the history of it. And after listening to that, I was like, I feel like he really filled in the gaps. But I don't remember his name. But if you go to Peter Boghossian, you can find this guy. And so it's like over the last really 100 years, how this sort of perspective has gained speed and then sort of the power that they got. And it's all through these education schools. And the reason I say that was because in the early 90s, I was living in Western Massachusetts in the Northampton area, and UMass Amherst is there. And a friend of mine was thinking about going to this new program that the education school had started. And it was all about social justice and social something something. And she thought it looked kind of cool because, she was an activist, she was a feminist, and she wanted to be anti-racist and all this. And, she was fighting the good fight. And this program had just started. And she came up to me. We had a community garden thing, and I was hanging out there. And she came over and she's like, "I want to ask you, what do you think about this?" And so she's explaining the program to me. And I had these like, I'm trying to, even at the time, I'm like trying to figure out why don't I like what she's telling me? There's something wrong here. And I remember saying, and this is clearly not an original not insight, because a lot of people have been saying this about religion. But I swear to God, in like 1992, I really did say this to her. I said, my problem with this perspective is that it puts all the onus on every individual. So instead of saying that racism is a problem that society has, what you're saying is it's all about individual consciousness. And so and it's essentially original sin because there's not actually a way out. When you look at it that way, there's no way. You can't ever say, "Oh, I'm not a racist." You're not allowed to say that because even just saying that makes you a racist. And this, of course, has been made very explicit by people like Robin DiAngelo. They come right out and say that. So you can't win. You either admit you're a racist or you say, "Well, I'm not a racist, but that proves you're a racist." So at the end
Right.
of the day, we're all racist and there's literally no way out.
The
Like, at
more that
least in
you
Christianity, you can go to confession, you can take
right,
communion, you can do you can at least try, you can accept Jesus, like, all those ways they have to get you out of original sin. There's at least a path forward, but in this, there is no way out. You are
right,
white, you are a racist, that's the end of it. And I was like, I just don't see a future in this. Who's
right,
gonna join a movement that's just about self-flagellation? And it honestly just looks like a very hopeless version of Christianity in terms of the original sin thing. And she's
right.
like, "Yeah, yeah, you're right. Okay, right." And so she never did the program, which probably were other reasons too. I don't think I particularly talked her out of it. The thing is, though, in 1992, we could have that discussion and still be friends. Now, I would never open my mouth in a room if people were talking about this, not unless they were all like pre-screened and I knew them, because
Right,
I know what would
exactly.
happen. I'd be driven out of the house within 10 minutes for even just like opening a conversation about, I'm not sure this is a great model. Why would people join this? Like, you're only just going to get masochists. Like, who else is going to want this? And then, like, the other part of that is the demand, to my mind, the demand used to be, you know what, we're human just like you. You need to identify yourself with us and try to see the world a little bit through my experience. I will try to see the world through your experience. But somewhere in all of this, we're all human beings together. And that's why it matters. None of us are so far beyond human that we can't understand something about the fact that this hurts me and I would like it to stop, and that you can empathize with that because you're also human. Like, we all bleed, you know?
Right.
It hurts when you hit us. It hurts when your children are hungry. Like, these are just universals. And we're a super social species. We're not just a social species, we're super social. And it really does matter to most of us. If you let us have those feelings, if you let us find a way to help each other, we will always do it, right? What's in the way is politics. It's nothing about us biologically. We're actually very attuned to each other, mostly because our young are so vulnerable for so long. We really do need the group to help,
Sure.
right? And so for most 2 million years, we lived in small groups of about 100, and that was how things happened. And now we've got modern life, and everybody's very alienated, and like blah blah. We can go on, but we managed to live in groups of millions, and we don't generally kill each other. There's no other species that could do that without just like mass slaughter. And it's because we're super social, because we need each other. So again, the demand, I mean, I remember having these workshops and these conversations where it's like you'd go around the room and be like, well, where are you people from? Let's hear the story. How did they get here? Why are you in this room? And everybody had a story, and it was like, well, my mom was here and my dad came from Eastern Europe and my blah blah, and then the war, and then they starved, and then my grandparents were killed, and you all had horrible stories, because that's what that's the human condition on planet Earth right now. And we could all see what we had in common.
Well,
We
and you
could
can't
all
even
see
ask people where they're
something.
from now. Like, have you noticed
You're
that?
not
Like,
allowed. I literally just yesterday, I was in New York City. I get in the Uber to get to the airport, and it was a woman driver, which to me is really rare. And she gets, we open the door, and I'm like, oh, this is so fun. Thank you for being my driver. I don't have to worry. You're a woman. And she's got like the beautiful braids and, very, very dark black skin. And I was like, and this lovely, lovely accent. And I'm thinking, maybe Nigeria. I'm not 100% sure. But my mother actually studied African history. Nigeria was her specialty. And I'm like, I want to talk to her about Nigeria because I have a feeling she's from that region just from the accent.
sure.
But I can't, because I'm going to get called a racist. And all I want to talk to her as a human being. Like, how did this get so wrong? And if you are brave enough to broach the conversation, I have never once met an immigrant who did not want to talk about the old country.
Right.
This includes, I mean, my dad's an immigrant. So, like, I come by this honest. Everybody wants to talk about where they're from. Everybody wants to talk about their family they left behind. Everybody wants to remember. They'll have all the anecdotes. They'll have, oh, where's your, and oh, my daughter is here, and but my grandparents, blah, blah, and they'll have the whole story, and you get to hear all of it, the joy and the horror of being human and what we all go through on this planet. And like, I can relate. This is my parents and my grandparents. Yeah, you might be black and I'm Northern European, but we have a similar story. We always will. Whether it's my child died, whether it's, I watch these people have to sacrifice everything for me. Like, where is this different in the human race? And that used to be the demand. You just need to see me as human. And then you will understand that when this hurts me, it's a problem. It wasn't that hard. And now I literally can't even talk to the taxi driver because I don't want her to think that I'm a racist. Whereas 10 years ago, we would have had a really fun conversation on the way to the airport.
Well, and
I
that's
wanted
like,
to hear about Nigeria. I actually know things about Nigeria. Like, I wanted to hear where she was from and like how she got here and what her life is like. And I'm a human being, and so is she. I'm getting all upset now.
no,
You can hear
no,
this,
you're
but
fine.
it
It's
just
the
makes
same
me
thing for
so.
me, is
That was
that
the whole point of the left, was that we were all human.
right.
We had a common story, and you were inviting people in to hear your story so they would see you as a human being, and then we could all fight with each other to make a better world. Like, we could be comrades, we could be friends, we could actually love each other. we could have a universal value of universal human rights. And
And
when
that
those were being
it
violated, we
was
cared about it.
everywhere
That
in
was
Occupy in the beginning. It was everywhere. Like, it was the most seamless situation in the beginning where, like, legit, like, everybody kind of pays lip service to the idea of, well, we should accept everyone. That was literally at the core originally, right?
yeah,
Like, when I was first at those camps, like, it didn't matter how trans you were, didn't matter how straight you were, didn't matter how whatever you were. If you were unified with us towards the purpose of let's make life better for all humans, period. And then there was this seamless, like, very quickly, the races of everyone involved, the genders of everyone involved, what people did in the privacy of their own bedrooms, it wasn't even part of your consciousness anymore. Like, it was a true unity that I honestly feel homesick for, because
I
after
know,
it was gone, you
I
never
know,
see it again,
I
right?
know, I
I mean,
know.
ironically, the closest thing I've ever seen to it was, my kids were boxers, and the boxing gym was incredibly diverse. That was the closest thing I can think of, and nobody even ever mentioned that the coach was black, that there were Hispanic, Asian, Arabs. Like, this is also one of the reasons why my kids didn't even know what racism was for many years. And then when they finally asked me and I explained it to them, they thought it was the most preposterous, ridiculous concept. Like, who does that? Like, what? Who cares? Like, it wasn't a matter of like they needed to have some major political statement about it. It was this is obviously silly. Why would anybody do that? Right. And to me, that was mission accomplished, but to the current activists, now that's not enough. Now your child has to self flagellate themselves for stuff that went on 400 years before they were born, done to other people before they were born. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about current oppression. That's not the issue. It's that we now, there seems to be this new thing that I also notice, is that there was a fundamental concept behind the entire civil rights movement. The all activist movements in general had the central concept of people should be judged by the content of their character, not the
Right,
color of their skin or their gender or
right,
whatever, right? And we still kind of sort of do that, but there's this new class of people that we're creating that it's totally acceptable for you to judge them based on their color, or their gender or like, there was this horrible comment that I encountered on Facebook recently, because there are people that are really far off on this, but they suggested that, well, statistics say that most rape is done by men, and therefore men are trash. And this is not a matter of opinion. Therefore, all men are trash. And I just said, okay, um, there's a subset of the population that can even do a horrific thing like that. And it's not all men, just like, you can't clutch your purse when you see a black man walk into the elevator, because it's not all black people either.
right,
And it's wrong to make such generalizations. And, so I replied to her and I said, if you want to just make it about arbitrary statistics, the statistics say that women perform more, what is it, or, perpetrate more child abuse. So therefore, should we suggest that therefore all women are trash because all child abusers are trash? Like, the point was supposed to be about, yes, you can recognize certain patterns that people need to adjust, but that doesn't mean that you as a person are accountable for everything done by anybody with a similar melanin level, with the
right,
same gender. Like, that
right,
used to kind of be a central focus. And now, well, these things are true as long as you're not white, straight, cis. Like, there's this new population of people that are automatically, like you mentioned earlier, the original sin, and they don't recognize, and this is something I did a whole video about this, because I went and read the studies, and the social sciences used to understand this, that the reason that Martin Luther King succeeds and the reason that militant activists fail is that if you spend all of your time essentially, like, I mean, pretty much all bigotry is based on kind of tribalistic instincts, that
right,
we as a species humans in general tend to be very arrogant and assume that all natural impulses are things that we are no longer susceptible to. It's terrible, because the reality is, if there's a tribalist instinct, if I identify myself as part of tribe A, and then you were attacking tribe A, well, then that immediately is going to cause me to psychologically respond by looking for flaws in your tribe and spitting them back at you. That the better solution is to try to not have tribe A and tribe B, to make us aware of the fact that we're all one tribe. then all of it goes away, right? And I watched is that we were one tribe. We were the 99%. We used to say that at all of our marches and everything. And then suddenly, no, now we're the 13% of the black trans, whatever people. And then we're also the 10% of this group. And then we all start fighting over which one of us is more oppressed. And then there's no unity anymore. And there's no effectiveness anymore. And that was kind of the one thing that I was thinking while you were talking about that, is it working? Or are they succeeding? Because I don't feel that they are. That this this
No, they're
this is not
not. They're
helping.
collapsing everything. They're making everybody hate them.
Right. And I would make this one more point, is that sometimes it feels like, say, it was more obvious in the racial movements, right? But it's like, it almost feels like whoever is navigating that, whoever is puppeteering it, socially engineering it, is diabolically racist. Because every day there's another thing that the civil rights movement achieved that they are undoing in the name of supposedly protecting the freedom of people of color. So, for example, now there's a stigma about marrying white people. Now we should have segregated spaces, where there are no white people. Now, like these things, like they don't realize, like, you're basically taking everything that was accomplished by competent activists before you and undoing it. And it just doesn't feel, it's hard to start. I mean, like, I don't have any hard evidence, but it starts to feel like it's not very accidental, like, and that was so. But anyway, that kind of plays. Go ahead and comment.
I just this past weekend I was doing a political training. I was in New York City, but before that I spent a day in Philadelphia visiting my dad, and that's where I grew up. And I'm always struck when I visit there now because I mean, he still lives in the same house I lived in when I was a teenager. And when I was a small child, the neighborhood was very segregated. It was not legally segregated, but they did all that redlining and just even culturally, everybody knew past this line, past this street, there's the black neighborhood, and this line forward is the white neighborhood. So we were like one block from where the black neighborhood started, and everybody knew, you had to walk around, you couldn't walk through it. And my mom was like one of the people who was like, "Oh, this is ridiculous. Walk the shortest distance. Like, don't be, this is, we're not playing these games anymore. We're going to have a better world." So we did that. And then, I had black friends, and like that was a big deal on my street in 1972, that there were black kids coming to my house, and a lot of the neighbors were upset about it. This seems like a foreign world now completely. Like, we did our job. All of us did a tiny little bit in our personal lives. And now when I go back to that neighborhood, it's completely unrecognizable in the best way possible. Next door there's a Korean immigrant family. There's the grandma, the kid, her children, and then they've got two teenagers. So there's like the little, the teenage girl with her violin, and it's like the same pattern. The grandmother speaks not very much English. The parents are fluent in both, and then the little girl, I'm sure, just mostly speaks English. But all up and down the street, it's the same thing. You've got the woman who's from the Dominican Republic, who's an immigrant, in her own life. You've got there's a mixed race couple right next door. I think he's Puerto Rican and she's white. Across the street is a black family, and all the kids play together in the street. They don't notice anything.
Right.
And I've seen them at the park, and then there's a park down sort of just around the corner, and they're there like playing tennis together. They're on their skateboards together. There's boys, there's girls, they're black, they're Asian, they're white. It's the exact world that we were after. And we pretty much achieved it. They're all going to date each other. They're going to fall in love with each other. They're all friends together. They're neighbors. There's no tension at all. It's just being neighbors. Oh, we got to worry about the garbage pickup. I know you parked in my spot when it snowed. Like, just stupid neighbor stuff is all that's left to deal with. And I just feel like mission accomplished. Why are we now having these ridiculous fights about, I don't even know the kinds of, it just makes no sense to me. I don't understand why we don't acknowledge we actually got somewhere. And we got it by following some very basic principles that indeed people like Martin Luther King tried to impart to us. And we did it. Like, why is this not a celebration? I see it in the neighborhood where I grew up. We absolutely made that beautiful progress. Everybody's they own their houses. They're establishing a little bit of, some generational wealth there. It's not a great neighborhood, but it's fine. It's perfectly fine for kids. And I'm so heartbroken when I see, like, we actually did this. And then I turn back to my beloved leftist movements, and it's like nothing but like one vampire feeding session after another. I
Right.
don't understand. Like, what? I'm still just going, what? I don't understand how this all happened.
Well, I honestly think that it makes me wonder because okay, so for example, one of the things because I had friends in the Ron Paul libertarian movement, and
Mhm.
they talked about the fact that there was astroturfing going on, like people were showing up to try to co-opt the Tea Party, right? And at that time, one of the other things I remembered, because this is around the time that the woke stuff showed up, was that um, Ron Paul appealed to the Tea Party, which was kind of a conservative Occupy in its own way, and said, "Why don't you guys go meet with Occupy and talk about your common enemies, like the banks and stuff like
Yeah.
that?" And I was like so excited because the funny thing is, like at the Occupy camp, I was the conservative whisperer. Like I'm the one they send to go talk to the conservatives when they show up because I know how to talk to them like human beings. And not all of them had the patience, you know. So when I was like, well, wait a minute, if you guys get to meet Ron Paul libertarians, you might really like some of them, you know. And this was a moment that I think could have been enormous because the right wing activist movements and the left wing activist movements could have had a powerful alliance on the issues that they did agree on, right?
Yeah.
And I feel
That's how
that,
movements are built. It's always by addition. It's never by subtraction. That's
right,
such a basic formula. I utterly
right.
bewildered how we got this so wrong.
But now we're not allowed to do that because now you're not allowed to, what is it, platform people. You know, you're not
Right.
allowed to, they're not just different, they're inhuman. Like they're not
Yeah, we have to
people.
monster everybody on the other side.
Right,
It's
exactly.
very it's like personality disorders run amok, like, all you can do is they're either with you or against you, and, if they're with you, then they're little angels, and if they're against you, then all you can do is, make them completely subhuman, never speak to them again, never even mention that "he who shall not be named," like, level of we can't even mention that this person exists on the planet because they're so unspeakable and untouchable. So we're
Well,
gonna just keep creating caste after caste of people that are so far away from us as human beings that we don't even acknowledge their existence.
Well, and I think that when you they because the funny thing is we're also so worried about Nazis, and it's not that you shouldn't be worried about Nazis. It's just that
But come on, how many of them are there? Like 20?
there really are not very many. But what they don't also realize that like this is something I have to bring up to the left all the time. Like George Orwell was actually a socialist and he wrote
Right,
Animal Farm and he
right.
wrote 1984 as warnings to fellow socialists.
Yes,
Like, don't
yeah.
do this. This is not okay. This is bad. But now there's this new cozy relationship with authoritarianism and censorship and like things that are not like okay. Like I just did a video because AOC is considered to be like a champion of the progressive movement and now she's all about censorship and now she's all about authoritarianism as long as it's hers. And I'm like, this should not be the heir apparent of the Bernie Sanders movement. I'm like, this is so wrong on so many levels. And like I talked to Derek about this. It's like they have no sense of history. Like they don't know about McCarthyism. They don't know about J. Edgar Hoover having a file on anybody who just
Yeah,
might whiff of communism, right? Like they don't understand that it is freedom of speech that is the reason that there is a left at all,
I
right?
know,
You know, and
I
and they
know.
did and they think, well, it's okay now because it's our censorship. It's good censorship because
And
it's
it's
our
gonna
and
flip in 20 years, and they're gonna wish that they had kept the
right.
First Amendment just like it was.
Or
They're
they'll
gonna be so
become
sorry when it's not. I think if they're not old enough, and they're not taught history, and they're not taught history for a reason.
and if you are taught that kind well, like it's very filtered, and that's why. And there's that's something that's very deliberate. Like Christina Hoff Sommers talks about it. I don't know what your opinion of her is. I don't listen to her all the time, but she kind of made a point where because people asked her because she calls herself the factual feminist or whatever. She's like, I watched as the professors would get tenure, get involved in writing textbooks, and start writing stuff that was just crazy. Like she's like, I considered myself a feminist, that I was like, this is not okay. You can't go here. So there's definitely an organized, concerted effort. You could point the finger at China. You don't want to sound like a Red Scare person, but there's somebody is organizing all of this. That's what it feels like. Whether it's the
I mean, for
wealthy trying to keep the
sure,
poor divided. Go ahead.
right. For sure, one of the things that's happening is that, and I'm sure the United States does this as well, but any country with a budget to do it is going to find the cracks in the system of their enemies. So China is going to look at the United States and say, "Oh, look at this. if we send out this meme that is going to inflame racist feelings, we can get the left to all, completely collapse itself, in disorganization and, sort of self-flagellation. So it's very easy to do that on social media, and Russia does the same thing, and I'm sure the United States is trying to do it back to them.
Oh
So,
yeah, yeah. It's
I mean,
not like what.
I'm
Yeah,
sure England does it. I'm sure like any country with a budget is doing this, right? Against their quote enemies. So that, I mean, that's I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think that that's absolutely common sense, that of course they're going to try to inflame. And it's very easy to do that now on the left. That's the problem. They
especially to
see
make
that,
them
racism
comfortable.
can,
Like when you're seeing Antifa activists carrying flags with Stalin and Mao on them, I'm like,
are you people serious?
right,
Did you just pick
exactly.
up a history book?
Right. Well, they're told that that's all capitalist propaganda. And I'm not saying that there isn't any capitalist propaganda, but no, Mao and Stalin were not good people.
Like mass
Um,
murders. I like literally don't have extended family because of Joe Stalin. Like
right.
my family survived this. Like this isn't some. And I see this all the time on Facebook. They're like, "Oh, you just believe U.S. propaganda." Like, no, I believe my father and my grandmother. Like they had to
Right.
flee
But
the country. Like I have
and
literally no
you're
extended family because of Joe Stalin. How can anybody hold this man up as some kind of? He's a monster, just like Hitler. Like all you get these sociopaths who are able to, run amok because nobody can stand up to them.
right, and that's hanging out in the black bloc, and for particularly for anarchist communists who make up the majority of Antifa, I'm kind of like, why are you guys tolerating these people? Like, you want to go punch people in the face because they're soccer moms protesting outside the Wii Spa because a pre-op trans man exposed themselves to their kids, because that's fighting the evil authoritarian fascism, but you're carrying a Stalin flag, like so that's why it leads me to believe that it's beyond just the issue of dividing the left. It's also this weird new cozy idea that for some reason authoritarian communism would be superior. Like that authoritarian, despotic communism is not superior to fascism. It's not better than being a Nazi. They're kind of in the same category, in my opinion. But I do think that there's a element to this as far as to what seduces the activists, and that's why I wanted to play this clip. And the funny
Okay.
thing is John Cleese made this bit a long time ago, and I think you're going to see a lot of what we're talking about in the modern sense in this clip. So let's take a moment. It's only about 2 minutes.
Seriously, though, we've heard a lot about extremism recently, a nastier, harsher atmosphere everywhere, more abuse and bother boy behavior, less friendliness and tolerance and respect for opponents. All right, but what we never hear about extremism is its advantages. Well, the biggest advantage of extremism is that it makes you feel good because it provides you with enemies. Let me explain. The great thing about having enemies is that you can pretend that all the badness in the whole world is in your enemies and all the goodness in the whole world is in you. Attractive, isn't it? So, if you have a lot of anger and resentment in you anyway, and you therefore enjoy abusing people, then you can pretend that you're only doing it because these enemies of yours are such very bad persons. And that if it wasn't for them, you'd actually be good-natured and courteous and rational all the time. So, if you want to feel good, become an extremist. Okay, now you have a choice. If you join the hard left, they'll give you their list of authorized enemies. Almost all kinds of authority, especially the police, the city, Americans, judges, multinational corporations, public schools, furriers, newspaper owners, fox hunters, generals, class traitors, and, of course, moderates. Or, if you'd rather be an extremist on the hard right, no problem, fine, you still get a lovely list of enemies, only they're different ones. Noisy minority groups, unions, Russia, weirdos, demonstrators, welfare sponges, meddlesome clergy, peaceniks, the BBC, strikers, social workers, communists, and, of course, moderates. And upstart actors. Now, once you're armed with one of these super lists of enemies, you can be as nasty as you like and yet feel your behaviors morally justified. So you can strut around abusing people and telling them you could eat them for breakfast and still think of yourself as a champion of the truth, a fighter for the greater good, and not the rather sad paranoid schizoid that you really are.
So I'm going to open up for comments from you first. What did you think of that?
I'd never seen that. That's hysterical. It doesn't surprise me. He's still fighting the good fight out there. That is, yeah, no, he saw it. He saw it coming.
And the point that he's getting at is, and I've seen it. Like I remember, okay, so like I live in these little country towns, and a Black Lives Matter chapter was forming in one of them, and I kind of like raised an eyebrow, like what? Like because before I even moved into the neighborhood, I asked someone who had lived there for many years, who was Black. I was like, "Is there any racism here?" Because I didn't want my kids exposed to that. And he's like, "No, not really." He's like, "There might be some people who privately think that way." He's like, "But I've never had any problems with getting jobs. Like nobody's threatened me, nobody's burning any crosses." He's like, "I raised my kids here, they're fine." Right. So the point is that there wasn't really an environment that was conducive to needing to march down the streets. But anyway, they invited me to their private Facebook group because they knew I was an activist. So I just kind of quietly tried to listen as this thing was forming. And the first thing I noticed was that they were not okay with peaceful stuff. Like there were people who kept showing up in the group who really wanted them to be as mean as possible. And then I was like, so you guys realize you're going to create more problems. Like it doesn't mean we should be quiet about police brutality. That's not what I said. But if you're going to go get up in people's faces and you're going to, yell and scream slogans at them angry as if the people of Milan are your oppressor, that this isn't going to help. And then I suggested maybe you guys should look at the way Daryl Davis does things, because that's the guy who, is a Black man who kind of rescues cult members from the
Right.
KKK.
No,
That's
he's
what I
amazing. Yeah, he's
right.
amazing.
And he did it by humanizing himself. And that
Yeah.
literally one of the activists who was one of the loudest Antifa kids was like, well, I don't want to convince people. I want them to be afraid. Like literally said that. And I was like, you obviously haven't studied the psychology of racism, have you? Because that's where it comes from. It's from fear, right? You fear, it comes back to that tribalistic instinct. Are these people a threat to my access to resources? Like, you look at it, it unfortunately is a natural thing, like, what is it? Is it gorillas? They'll literally just declare war on each other and then like, eat each other down to the babies if they think you're a threat to their area. I can't remember which species. Derek could probably spit that out. And not all primates are like that. They're like the bonobos are very peaceful. But the main point is that that's the instinct that you're activating by acting like that. And it isn't
Yeah.
necessary. You should be projecting yourself as, hey, we're actually pretty cool. We're not bad people. And then that whole thing just starts to be disarmed like a bomb, right? You disarm it like a bomb. You don't walk up and punch it and then expect it not to explode, right? But the issue of that's why I bring up that John Cleese quote, is that some of these kids are what I call rage addicts.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
they come on and their righteous indignation is an addiction. And then he was making that video was before the internet. So now it's so much worse because I can just get on Twitter and pretend like I'm doing something good for the world by being a snot to a bunch of people who are not in any way going to be convinced by anything I say. So like in my Discord channel, because my viewership is diverse, I have one major rule. And it's interesting how difficult it is for people on the left right now to follow this rule. But it is, you guys can say whatever you want, no personal attack, right?
Mhm.
And there are a couple leftists in there, but there's not many. And it's largely because the left now is in a state where we're kind of reliant on censorship. Like, if I don't, that's what the thing with AOC saying deplatforming works because Tucker Carlson gets fired by Fox. It's that if I don't like what you're saying, you should not be allowed to say it. If you disagree with me, you should not be allowed to talk. Like that's not only does it's not just a matter of that's immoral censorship. It's that it doesn't work. Like I said in my video about AOC versus Bernie, because Bernie's not pro censorship, was that like you're worried about Nazis. Well, censorship failed the Nazis. It didn't work. In the long run, it was a horrible thing. They killed activists like Sophie Scholl, who's a hero of mine. But it didn't work. In the end, they were defeated. Like you can't silence the opposition for so long. You have to convince them that what they're doing is wrong. And that includes feminism, it includes racism, it includes all of these things. And the LGBTQ activism is also headed in that direction. Like I remember here in our small town, because there's LGBTQ teachers who are literally having conferences about how they can start these little clubs and call them diversity clubs, or not even give them a name about what they're really about. And then the reality is that they're planning to expose your kids to a bunch of stuff, and they're looking for kids, specifically kids who don't have any friends, to kind of recruit them into this, right? And the thing is that in the town that we were in at the time, I'm sure that there was some bigotry, but it just like the racism was kind of quiet. Like, we knew there was an LGBTQ community, but nobody was, actively hunting down gay kids and beating them up. Like, it wasn't the 80s, in that aspect, right? So then this diversity club, which, they did their presentation about what it was supposed to be about, and the conservatives kind of watched quietly, but they didn't say anything. But then they paint this rock in front of the elementary school, and they cover it in all of these different flags, right? And the conservatives at this point are like, what the hell's this about? Like, this was supposed to be something you guys were doing among yourselves, but more than that, they lied about it in a way that was not, it was so obvious. Like, if you put the trans flag and the pansexual flag, all these, we know what those are. And they literally just, like, the adults in the situation said, well, it's just shapes and colors. I'm like, no, come on. Like, you know what that is. Like, if you really wanted to solve this problem, and I said this to them, like, if you guys had an LGBTQ kids club of kids who went out and did good deeds in the neighborhood, like found like grandmothers who can't mow their lawn, like that kind of stuff would have been enormous for outreach and humanizing these gay kids to the rest of the community. Like, that would have been so effective. But instead, we create this situation where now there's well, not only are we putting this huge statement by taking this rock in front of the elementary school and turning it into a pride activism rock, we're also going to lie about it. We're going to lie about the nature of these clubs. We're going to tell kids it's okay to lie to their parents about what they discuss in these clubs, and then wonder why they get backlash from the parents. Like, this is not effective. Again, it's maybe it made you feel good to do that, but what was your goal? If your goal was to try to fix any problems, you have done the opposite. And again, this is all understood by social science and has been for a long time. But now the social sciences are completely co-opted by this stuff. I just had a sociologist named Dr. Turner on my show, and he was a very well-published sociologist, and he's a leftist, like straight up from the 60s, and he's like, I just watched as my science was just decimated. He's like, they can just put anything they want out now and say that it was a study. He's like, it's garbage and it's ruining sociology. He's like, look, I'm all about racial equality. And, he's like, I was literally part of the marches where we used to get beat up all the time. He's like, but this is not right. You can't do this. And you brought up Peter Boghossian. I actually had him on my show too, because he's made famous by the grievance studies affair, where we can, just let's just write fake articles and pretend that we researched them. Let's take a chapter of Mein Kampf and rewrite it as a feminist piece, and then just see if we can get that published. And then they did, right?
It's brilliant. It was brilliant.
And so then, I mean, obviously, I imagine that there may have been radicals among feminists of your generation who might, like, I don't know, fantasize about the idea of like Mein Kampf being a feminist book, but like, that's never been part of the feminism that I was aware of. Am I wrong? Did I miss something? Like this idea that, we should we just line them all up, and put them on trains? I mean, go ahead.
No, well, the first time that I came into contact with those hoax articles, the one about the dog park, that was the one that I think really just like sort of broke through to the mainstream. And somebody sent it to me. It was like, what in the world is this? And I read it and I was like, I can tell you what this is. Somebody is having fun. This is not real. It is very well done. They're making a point and nobody seems to get it. But I can guarantee you this is a piss take and it's a really good one. And I wish someday I could meet these people and buy them a beer. I've got no idea who they are, but behind the scenes, they are laughing. They are laughing so hard. And then the whole thing broke open and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what this was. It was brilliant. From beginning to end. And also, I highly recommend reading that book that James Lindsay and Helen Plucko's wrote about the woke thing, which is really good. And all of Peter Boghossian's work is good too. So
You brought up John McWhorter. He's
oh,
fantastic.
and John, I just love him. He really helped me a lot. I gotta say, I was like obsessed with his podcast for a while. I was like, I need to understand this. Where did we go so wrong? And he's just so human to everybody. Like he just seems like a really nice guy on top of it all, but obviously super smart. And so
And
he's
he's
really able
fearless. Like,
to
have you ever
he
watched him
is.
debate? He
Yeah.
does not get rattled. It
No,
is
he's
like
great. He's got
his stone
everything.
face
He's
looked
held his
right
been a
at you.
teacher
It's
for
crazy.
years, and I bet he's a great dad. So I very much appreciate him. I'm gonna have to go because we've been on for an hour,
Oh,
but I'm
okay.
happy to do a part two because I know we only barely touched on some of the things we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about the trans stuff yet.
We did not. One of your listeners had a question, so I will just answer it by saying I've been fighting the transgender stuff since like 1982. So I've been in this a long time, and I have watched all of this unroll. And there's a lot I could say about it. So anyway.
All right. Well, I'm gonna
We
go
should
ahead
say
and
our goodbyes. This has been so much fun, though. It's
right.
very
Well,
nice
let
to talk
me
to, like,
what I'll do
normal
then is
lefty people who still know how to be human is always a relief to my soul.
well, no, and I hope it was helpful to you. What I'm gonna do then is say my outro, and then I'd like to talk to you super brief offline, and then we'll go. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in today. And like I said, I don't know what you guys expected. You should know by now, like what kind of people I bring on. It's extremely rare that I bring on somebody that I'm going to have an outright argument with. Surprisingly, actually, though, coming up pretty soon, I've been asked to moderate a debate between crowdsourced politics and logical checkmate. I believe it's on issues of foreign policy. You guys can check that out. It's going to be next Sunday. Thank you guys for tuning in today. And I hope that you will also show up for my next conversation with Lierre, because we're going to discuss a lot of things that I think that, even those of you who are conservative in my audience will understand why you should be hearing this. Because, just like when I brought on the trans activists that I brought on before who were against grooming, there are plenty of people, on the other side of things from where from at least from what you perceive yourselves to be, who also don't agree with the indoctrination of children, who don't agree with the trans stuff, who don't agree with, like the insanity. These people exist, and I'm one of them. Like I always tell you guys, I'm left leaning. I told you who I voted for. I don't expect you to agree with me about everything. That's not what this is about. In fact, I don't want you to, but I do want you to think about what I say. And if that brings you around to changing your point of view about anything, then fine. But at the very least of all of this, I hope that you guys can listen to these conversations and get an idea that there are actually people on the left who are not insane. Thanks for tuning in, folks. And Lierre, I linked your website down below. Is there any other way that is there anything coming up for you that you'd like to tell people about?
What are we doing? Too much to talk about, honestly. I wouldn't even know where to begin. You can go to my website, and you can also go to womensliberationfront.org, which is one of my organizations. So you can go there and see all about our lawsuits, all about our amicus briefs, all the stuff that we're trying to do to kind of push back on some of this. So those are
All
the two
right.
places to go. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys, for tuning in.